So I'm very pleased to introduce Jan van Sarten, whom I realize I've known for 18 years. He got his degree in mathematical psychology from the University of Michigan in 1979. He went to work at Bell Labs and then at NYU and then back to Bell Labs again, which is where I met him in '86. In 2000 he left Bell Labs to head up the Center for Spoken Language Understanding at the American Graduate Institute, which is where he still is. Please introduce Jan.
Okay, thanks very much for your kind introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me here. What I'll be talking about today is about applying speech and language technologies to communication disorders. And the key points are the following. Is first of all that there is actually a really large number of potential applications, and I underline potential because most of the things that we would like to do we can't do yet. Applications of speech and language technologies to communication disorders. Now some of these applications they can be done right now. So that's not really that interesting. That is for speech technology people, although it may be very interesting for clinical people. But there are other ones that really require some serious either applied or basic technology research. And so what I'm kind of will be claiming is that this really presents some new opportunities for the speech and language technology community that we all belong to. And the way I'm going to kind of make that case is by just showing, going through a couple of preliminary studies that we have done along these lines. So the outline is the following thing. First, I just want to define some of the terms that we all know how I happen to be using these terms. Secondly, I'm going to go through a couple of these examples. First, I'll be talking about three dysarthria examples, then about a disorder called suspected apraxia of speech, if I have time, and then a few things with autism, then future plans, summary. Okay, so first define the terms. So communication disorders is, I use it in a very general term. So you have things such as, hearing loss, congenital deafness, receptive aphasia, which is, often a result of traumatic brain injury. You have, this whole fuzzy class of childhood language disorders called developmental language disorders, DLD. Autism, even though autism is generally, understood as a communication disorder, certainly communication disorders are an aspect of autism, and so forth. Also output examples such as apraxia, stuttering, dysarthria, which is what I will be talking about extensively, aphasia, and so forth and so on. Yeah?
Some of these words are not familiar to me. So what is aphasia? Would you mind?
Oh, aphasia, well, literally it means inability to speak, but you also have a receptive, that is,
Aphasia is inability
yeah,
to speak.
right, literally, that's the Greek root of it. And well, autism, I assume people know. And
so receptive aphasia means
inability to understand speech. So you have a receptive disorder associated with expressive. By the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time. If you have a lot of discussion, that's fine because I can easily skip some parts of the talk. Okay, so speech technology. What else is new? Just, speech recognition, coding, text-to-speech, voice transformation, what have you. Okay, so I use both terms, communication disorder and speech technology in a very broad sense. Now, when you think about the kind of applications we might consider, first as the end-user perspective, and it's kind of important to make some distinctions here. Assistive devices are kind of analogous to crutches. So it's not diagnostic because you already know what's the matter, and you're also not trying to cure or make anyone feel better. Okay, it's purely assistive, just like a crutch. Remedial does mean treatment, curing, and diagnostic is well self-evident. And there's a whole bunch of additional applications which don't really directly affect the user perspective, and that is that speech technology is able to also produce very useful research tools for the clinical research community. Okay, then from our perspective, and already anticipated on that early on, that you can have various degrees in terms of how much basic research is needed. And of course, what I found really interesting is the last one, the research on fundamentally new technologies. I'm not that interested at all in technologies that are ready to go. Okay, so let's go through the first bunch of examples. That's dysarthria. So it is a motor speech disorder. People who have dysarthria generally, cognitively, they are completely normal. Not necessarily, because it depends a little bit on what is causing the dysarthria. So, for example, when you have TBI, traumatic brain injury, of course, all kinds of other parts of the brain may be affected too, and not just those that control the, the speech motor system. Then you have Parkinson's, you have Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, you have stroke, and so forth and so on. There's quite a number of people who have that in the United States, 1 to 2 million. And just to give you a flavor of how difficult to understand it is.
The air, they act like a pigeon.
So I'm sure that very few of you were able to make out any words at all. I have listened many times to this recording. I still don't know what is being said here. And so the key problem, of course, that we want to address is, would it be nice to have something that can make the speech more intelligible? Yeah?
Is he consistent? In other words, his family understands him?
It depends very much, because there are 6 different syndromes. In some cases, like spastic or hyperkinetic dysarthria, they can be all over the place. You ask them to say the same word 5 times and do completely different things. But in other cases, it's just very sharply reduced speech, but it is fairly consistent. So it depends. It depends very much. Now, what's interesting is, as I say here, is that indeed at times it's highly variable. But some of the distortions that you see are actually quite interesting. For example, the particular speaker that we have been working with, who's not this person, may pronounce the word tip as temph. Okay, now when you look at that from an articulatory point of view, there's actually quite a bit of order here. Okay, because what's happening here clearly is that, in order to go from an E to a P, you have to do several things at the same time. You have to stop voicing, you have to close your lips, and you have to very quickly open up your lips. And at the same time, you have to keep your vedic flap closed, because there's nothing nasal going on here. Well, what's happening here then is that first of all, the person cannot stop voicing at the right moment. So instead of stopping the voice at the point that the lips close, she continues to voice. So that's how you get the M, which then also is a result of the fact that the vedic flap never closes. So several of these dysarthric syndromes involve constant nasalization. Everything is nasalized.
Are they aware how they speak?
Oh yeah, painfully so.
I see.
Yeah.
So they understand normal speech and they know how it should sound?
Yeah, they can't do anything about it. It's just, it's like, having a partial paralysis of your leg. You know it very well, and you try very hard to move it right, but you can't. And then the F results from the fact that they cannot open up the lips crisply and quickly. It goes very slowly, and so that's why you have a period of frication there that then sounds like an F. Now, so when you look at it on an articulatory level, it's fairly easy to understand what's going on. A thing that's interesting, by the way, is that the P here is not produced as a N followed by S or something like it. In other words, the plates of articulation seems to be fairly, well preserved here. Okay, so these are just some general remarks about dysarthria, and what we want to do is 3 different things. One is that we want to work on a box that enhances the intelligibility of these individuals. That is literally a box that they will talk through and comes out of the other side through a loudspeaker is something people can more easily understand. The second thing that we are doing is trying to look a little bit at the co-articulatory phenomena in dysarthric speech, and we're doing that both for diagnostic purposes and for assistive purposes. And finally, we'll be talking about personalized TTS, that is the speech synthesizer that is particular to this particular individual, in fact, by trying to mimic the voice of that person the way he or she sounded before she got the disease. Okay, so that's okay. Yeah, we hear lots of complaints. The person that we work with, Melanie Fried-Oken, she's a clinician who sees these people. And any of them that use assistive devices get really fed up with, always sounding like perfect Paul. So that is the deck dog, primary voice. They have other complaints as well, but they really would like to sound like they once did. And that's a real...
They remember how they sound. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know how I sound, right? No, seriously, if I knew how I sounded, I'd speak perfect English. And I have an accent because I don't know how
Yeah, well, accents we can't do anything about. I mean, I've looked at that too myself for a few reasons. Okay, so what we want to have is, it's pretty ambitious. So we want to have a device that has unrestricted vocabulary as input. And of course, unlabeled speech, because, of course, this would be a device where you don't have a labeler available. And the output then should be something that is better, both in terms of intelligibility and in terms of quality. Okay? Now, we did some preliminary work, and one thing that definitely did not work, which was the very obvious thing, is, hey, why don't we just train the hell out of a speech recognizer and then send the result through a synthesizer? And if you use a very small vocabulary, 10 or 20 words or something like that, that generally works. In fact, there's a group of people at Sheffield University that has made that work. And we are working a little bit on that, but not too much, because we are really going along a whole different path. The other thing that didn't work was you have quite a bit of research on voice transformation systems. And on these voice transformation systems, the way they kind of work in general is that you get parallel recordings of a source speaker and a target speaker. You do a time warp, and then you basically find some kind of a mapping between the power spectra or line spectral frequencies, what have you. And actually, one of our postdocs, Alex Kane, he produced a very good voice transformation system that at the time he did it was probably one of the best in the world. So anyway, we had high hopes for that to be able to help us here, and the answer was no, it didn't help at all. It didn't produce any intelligibility enhancement. We also did a couple of perception experiments, to kind of pin down a little bit, which aspects of this arthritic speech matter. And we didn't have any particular assumptions, and so we did a bunch of experiments using hybridization, where we basically take a normal speaker and then we would transplant various facets of that to a dysarthric recording. So either just the vowels or the formants or the consonants or the prosody. And what we found, not surprisingly, was that basically everything helps. Okay, and so that gave us then permission to do the easy thing, which is to focus on vowels, because vowels are, in many ways easier than, for example, trying to model the dynamics of consonant mispronunciation. Okay, so here's what we built in, is a system that performed several steps in a row and ultimately produced the output using good old-fashioned formant synthesis. Okay, and so this is what we did, and I'll get into more details in a sec. So first we find things that we call stable points on formant trajectories. Now, formants, of course, are have become hugely unpopular in the community because they're so difficult to estimate, and that is true even more so in the case of dysarthric speech, where you can have all kinds of voicing irregularities to make it really holy hell to estimate any good formant trajectories. But all that we need here is some kind of rough estimate of the average formant value within the loudest portion of the vowel. Okay, and so we do that, and as I'll show you, we succeed in doing that, and we call those points stable points. Okay, the second thing that we do is fairly conventional, is that we use parallel recordings of a dysarthric speaker and a control speaker. You don't need a whole lot of recordings, say a few hundred words, that's all we use here. And then we perform a mapping in first formant by second formant by duration spaces. Okay, now one thing that's a little bit of interest here is, why on earth do we throw duration in here? And one reason is that certain sounds that are, at least in the American English dialect, fairly close in formant space, like the and the Those are actually two vowels that I still have a hard time distinguishing. That actually are quite far apart in duration. The eh is one of the longest vowels there is, and the eh is one of the shortest vowels there is. So that's why we threw that in. Okay, and then we use very standard Gaussian mixture mapping for that. Then the next thing is that, so now when the speech comes in, so we estimate a stable point, we map it onto the mapped stable point, and then we simply draw a synthetic Foreman trajectory through it. Okay, so the new Foreman trajectory may have a completely different shape than the original one. Okay, and certainly will have a different stable point. We do essentially the same thing for pitch and energy. We create a totally artificial pitch contour, and then finally we use Foreman synthesis. Okay, let me get a little bit more into details. So if you can see this, this is kind of what we start out with. This on the left we have the Foreman space, just the corner sounds here, e, a, and u, of a control speaker. And then here we have it of the Desarthric speaker. And among the things that you see in a Desarthric speaker is a very drastically compressed F1 range, and also F2 is not very good. These were computed, by the way, by getting the computing medians of midpoints of vowels that were manually tracked. Okay, so there's not any Foreman tracking errors in here. It's interesting to note that different Desarthric speakers will have very, very different vowel spaces. There are cases that just maybe a tiny little triangle around here for all vowels. Other cases are totally flattened down, what have you. So all over the yeah.
So this is for one particular speaker.
Yes. Yes.
So in principle, you'd have to do this for every person.
Right, absolutely. And when you think about that, that's really not such a big deal because, the same way as when you get, any kind of prosthesis, you will spend, quite a bit of time, fitting it. I mean, it's even true for dentures, whatever. So, but yeah, they're remarkably different. Like all normal people are the same, all abnormal people are different. So these Foremans are pretty bad, obviously. Okay. So now what you do with getting these stable points is that first we determine the 50% central region of the vowel. Okay, and we do that by having an automatic segmenter find the vowel regions. To make life easy for ourselves, we just had CVCs here, consonant, vowel, consonants, set in isolation. And of course, it's still quite a ways from there to, continuous speech.
One more question on the previous
Sure,
one.
please.
So for the normal speakers, I guess there would be some sort of spread around each of those points.
Yeah.
Is the spread bigger for these speakers? So if you're going to use a Gaussian mixture to detect which
Yeah,
vowel.
yeah, I'll show it in a sec. It's definitely bigger. Okay, so the first process is that we get the central region of a vowel. All of this is done automatically, unsupervised. And then we're going to make some kind of decision about the basic shape of the Foreman trajectory, with errors and all in it. Then we do a median smooth, and then we do a multitonic fit. Now, by multitonic fit, I mean something like this. And there's an area of statistical estimation that's concerned with what's called isotonic regression. And a formal definition of isotonic regression is that suppose you have numbers x1 through xn, try to find numbers y1 through yn that first have the property that they are monotonically non-decreasing. Non-decreasing, and secondly, you minimize the sum squares. This is a process that is guaranteed to converge. And the interesting thing about it, of course, is that you're not making any assumptions whatsoever about the y's. Okay, you're not saying that they got to be sigmoid in shape or whatever. Okay, so it's completely free of any kind of model. And in multitonic, what we're basically doing there is that suppose that you hypothesize that a bunch of points truly, have a single peak somewhere despite enormous amount of noise. What you do is very simple. You just do a little grid search, and for each point that you hypothesize to be the peak, you do an isotonic regression in a region preceding it, and an antitonic that is decreasing fit for the region after it, and you find the point where that is minimized. Okay, and so that's what we do. Okay, now F1 and F2 are treated differently. In F1, it's kind of known that the intrinsic F1s of consonants are very low. I forgot the numbers, like 175 to 250 or something like that. Definitely lower than any of the vowels. So we just simply make the assumption that it's always concave. Okay, and so once we know that, then we can use the multitonic fit to get the peak and to get a decent fit. The F2 is different because there you can definitely have cases where the true Farman trajectory is increasing or decreasing or single dipped or single peaked. And so we simply try out all those 4 different cases using multitonic regression and find out which one fits the best. And that then we decide is the true value. One little detail with this fit is that isotonic regression, and I didn't put it in the equation, actually uses weights, okay? And those weights give you a great opportunity to downplay the impact of data points that you may have great doubts about. So, for example, you can have a detector that looks at local pitch irregularities, and when you find it, then you can say, well, that weight should be a little bit lower because we're not so sure about this point. Okay, so I can play some pretty good games with that. Yeah?
Are you applying the isotonic regression to the roots of an LPC polynomial, or how do you get the candidates?
Yeah, we get it from right. Right, not say we don't apply straight or something like that, or very basic. Also, one reason for that is that the ultimate dream is that this would run in real time. So we want to have something that's fairly quick. So here are then the data that the whole system has to deal with. The dashed ellipsoids represent the Gaussians of each of the vowel categories. And the green ones were where we allowed each vowel category to split into 2 subcategories. So those were determined automatically. And so what you definitely see is an enormous amount of overlap here between the and the e. Okay, and so this is just F1, F2 space. We didn't put duration space in there. Whereas here, things are, in the normal speaker, things are quite separate. Okay, so one way to think about this is that there are really 2 things wrong here. One is you have this tremendous overlap, and the other is that really the whole vowel space is kind of in the wrong part of the Farman space. Okay, you really would like to stretch things out certainly in this way. Okay, so that even if there's still overlap, at least you make it better intelligibility, because now a larger percentage of the vowels will be in the appropriate areas of the Farman space. So this is then the result of the mapping, where the solid ellipsoids are now the Gaussians of the mapped stable points. The dashed ones are the ones of the original normal speaker. So it certainly has a much better correspondence now with the normal speaker, but you still have the overlap. But at least the hope is now that, for example, these instances of the ah will be more solidly perceived as ahs rather than as the oos or the us where they originally were. So we did a perceptual experiment on that, but let me just first finish off the process. So for the formants, we actually used simply horizontal lines, and you might say, my God, that's really a bad idea because you're going to get these terrible formant discontinuities at the consonant vowel and vowel consonant boundaries. But for reasons that we don't quite understand yet, that turns out to not to make any difference. So we don't quite understand the perceptual side of why formant discontinuities at consonant vowel boundaries don't matter. We don't understand that. Then the pitch is just single peaked function, totally by rule, totally artificial, and the energy we just subject to very heavy smooth. So here's an example then. So we have here this Arthuric original. So the person trying to say cop here, okay? Okay, so it's a heavy creaking, a very irregular energy contour, and actually the wrong vowel instead of an O. And then after transformation, okay, there's a couple of things worth noting. First of all, the vowel has clearly improved. There's much more O-like than originally. Secondly, it's totally smooth. And third, it really kind of sounds like this particular person, okay? And we don't understand that either because there's very little of the original signal that we preserved. Okay, we preserved some aspects of the fricative energy, but not a whole lot. Okay, and so I don't know what it is. Is that because there's some information in the consonants that whatever defines the identity of what follows, that we don't know. Let's just listen one more time to it. Okay, so we did an experiment then where we compared 5 different conditions. The first one was just raw dysarthric. What do people think this is? It's loss with an L and not a W. But yeah, it indeed sounds like a W. Then condition clean is similar to the condition where we did the entire mapping, except we did not change the stable points. So we do all the smoothing out and so on, but not any improvement of the stable points. So that sounds like this. And now the mapped. And now oracle. In oracle, what we did is that we took as the stable points of the normal speaker. Okay. And here's the normal speaker.
Loss.
Okay. So we did 2 perceptual tests. One is quality, where we had side-to-side comparisons, and people had to decide on a -2 to +2 scale which one they like better and by how much. And the second was a 8 alternative first choice vowel identification experiment. Okay, and the first experiment, the quality test, basically showed that we didn't screw up when we replaced the original pitch contour with a smooth pitch contour. And so this is highly significant, and we actually split the data into data where our vocal fry detector says there was vocal fry, and the other half where it wasn't. So when you confine the analysis to the cases where there was vocal fry, then you got unanimous preference. Okay, so this is a very powerful result here. And then the second one, which you found more interesting, more importantly, is the intelligibility. Like, is it when it goes through this whole multi-step process, you're throwing away an awful lot of information, so all kinds of things go wrong. And in fact, in earlier cases, things indeed did go wrong. Okay, and so we managed to make it worse, not to make it better. But so we improved things by various things, and so the result that we got now was a 7% increase in intelligibility, and so that was statistically significant. Let's listen to it. Okay, and a really interesting case is this one here. So this is the when you use as the stable points those of the control speaker, and so this is kind of exactly the same process as is used in the regular mapping, except now the mapping is completely perfect. Okay, but nevertheless you do all these other operations that lead to a lot of loss in information, and so when you had by magic the perfect targets, then you would have a 40% increase in intelligibility, which is very large. And this is 40% just on the absolute scale. Okay, that is, we're going up from, I believe, 41% correct to 81%. So that's a very large difference here. Now the thing that bothers us is that when the only thing you do is the cleaning up operation, it actually gets worse, and that then may very well be the result of all these information losing transformations. Okay, so the summary then, so we got this small intelligibility enhancement effect. We're pretty happy about it because we don't think that that has been done before. I mean, there's some very obvious things you can do in this area. Like one thing, there's actually a product on the market that's called the enhancer, and for the small price of $7,000, you essentially end up buying an amplifier. Okay, but it really works, of course, in cases where people have very little lung pressure. People can only whisper. So for that can certainly happen, but it is really a trivial instrument, and it makes me slightly angry to see people being charged 7 to. They have deluxe models for up to $20,000. I think that's not right. So the quality enhancement he did clearly worked very well. And we have still quite a lot of stuff to do. The one is understand why the clean was bad. But the other thing that's really much more challenging is, and I'll talk about it in a sec, is can we do something more about the huge overlap between these vowel distributions? Okay, and so that's where de-articulation, as we call it, will come in. Okay, so the next thing then is to talk about co-articulation. So when you think again about those vowel triangles, you can come up with a couple of different stories about why it's so compressed. So one is that because these are not averages obtained in repeats of the exact same CVC. Okay, there are different consonants all over the place. So maybe you just have a lot more co-articulation in this arthria, and the overall net effect of co-articulation of different consonants with whose virtual formants are all over the place, but on average are in the center of the vowel space, that may have the effect of compressing the vowel space as computed in this particular way. Okay, so that's one idea. The second idea is that, well, maybe you just have enormous amounts of variability, but instead of being nice and Gaussian, maybe the distributions are highly skewed because of the limits of the articulatory apparatus. You just cannot produce a sound that has an F2 of 5,000 hertz, for example. Okay, so that would skew towards the center. And then the third one would be that maybe they're just trying to pull things in the wrong direction. Okay, so it may be the case that suppose your leg is partially paralyzed and you ask to move your head forward, that they just for whatever reason internal representation of their articulatory system, whatever, they just move it towards the left. Who knows? So that's the bad target theory. So here are three theories. Okay, now the way we go about it is to produce a very simple linear co-articulation model. And here we go. So the idea is that your observed formant at time t of a vowel v with a preceding consonant p following consonant n is written as a linear combination of 3 target formant vectors that correspond to the preceding consonant, the vowel itself, and the following consonant. And these are then weighed by weight matrices. Okay, everything 3 by 3 in dimension 3 or dimension n, doesn't matter really. So the way we approach this then is to consider all these parameters as being not directly observable, just unknown parameters. Okay, because as it turns out that when you go through the method, I mean, it's a very simple linear model, and so when you go through the usual calculations of checking whether the Jacobian matrix of the mapping is of maximal rank, it turns out that with the proper combinations of consonants and vowels in your database, you are able to do the estimation. Okay, which is kind of nice because the only data points we have here is the formants in the centers of the vowels. Okay, we're not making any observations whatsoever about the consonants. Okay, and that's of course the the benefit that you get out of having such a terribly simple model. Okay. Now, this is not at all new, so a whole bunch of people, decades ago started working on linear modeling of form trajectories like Broad, Ehrman, Lindblom, Schouten, Paul, Stevens, what have you. So now there are 2 things we want to do with the co-articulation model. One is to use it for deco-articulation, which then may produce deco-articulated stable points for the intelligibility enhancement, which then, so we would hope, would produce less overlap between the distributions. And the other use will be for diagnostics. So let's talk first about this here. And so we haven't gotten anywhere yet here because I haven't started working along these lines yet. So when you look again at the same model, you can kind of flip it around a little bit and say that, hey, suppose that I have estimates already of these weight matrices, and suppose that I know a little bit, not too much, but suppose I know a little bit about these consonants. Suppose, for example, that I know their place of articulation. Then you can estimate these, formant values of the vowel, the target formed values of the vowel, simply by by this matrix inversion formula. Okay, so that's the idea, and so you observe, of course, the forms in the vowel. Okay, and all these guys are coming from a what we call virtual form recognition, or place of articulation estimation. And then the idea is to use the result of that matrix multiplication as a new stable point, which is now completely deco-articulated. So in the ideal case that the model is completely true, what you get out of this operation is exactly the same format values for the vowels, no matter in what context. Okay, but of course that's not how reality works. Then, as far as the virtual form recognition, the little experiment on dysarthric speech using 5 consonant classes divided in terms of place of articulation and having W and L treated separately. So we got 86% correct, which is not bad, but not perfect either. So anyway, so that was just one process that we're just setting in motion right now, and we hope to get somewhere within the next year or so. Therefore, diagnostic use, going back again to these different theories about what might cause, what might be responsible for this, compressed vowel space, or there's articulation, random variability, and incorrect targets. There are correlates in the model that may cast some light on that. For example, you can look at the sizes of these weight matrices. For example, the traces, the sums of the diagonal elements. You can look at the model fit as a measure of random variability. Of course, model fit reflects a lot more than just random variability. It also reflects the degree to which the entire articulatory process actually is linear. And it's quite possible that in dysarthric speech it's not linear at all, whereas in normal speech it is. Okay, and finally you can look at these targets, but just looking at the estimates of these vowel formants. So that's the thing that we did first. Okay, and so when we estimate these idealized formant values, then you get some expansion for the normal speaker, and quite a bit extension here, where in fact now this sound here is fairly normal. Okay, for the ah. For the eh, it is still hopeless. Okay, and so that kind of gives us a lot of hope that that if we were to do the dearticulation, that at least some of the sounds would end up in the right place. But it's certainly not going to work everywhere at all. Okay, so you would say in this case that okay, so certainly part of the problem of the dysarthric speaker, if the model is correct, is that he kind of goes in the wrong direction for the S sound. She does. Here's another speaker, and this is here I have a different thing. So here the ah is still completely wrong, and then the e has a sound that is too far up. A couple of other parameters we can look at. So here are the distributions of the weight parameters, and so we scaled it in such a way that you have more articulation, in this direction, and so you see that the normal speaker, as we had hoped, there the articulation weights are fairly small, which means that the vowel midpoints are not affected a whole lot by the surrounding consonants, whereas in the case of the dysarthric speaker, the average value is much higher. There's much more articulation. One thing I should say is that the dysarthric speaker is talking way slower than the normal speaker. Something like between 2 and 2.5 times as slow. So it is not the case that you have more articulation in dysarthric speech because the person is talking faster. Okay, the person is talking a lot slower.
What is the norm of those
yeah, for simplified versions of those matrices, like they're diagonal here. Okay, and here very similar results for another pair of speakers. So the goodness of fit, not surprisingly, you have not a very good fit for the dysarthric speaker, and so we have to find out to what degree that is caused by just the model being inappropriate versus the speaker being highly variable, and the fit here for the control speaker is actually remarkably good. Okay, I'm going to skip this. There's a slightly different model that essentially gives the same results.
Can I ask you a question
Yeah.
about that, though? The red vowel, this prediction, is it consistent with perhaps some sort of physiological analysis or some diagnosis of the patient?
That certainly would be important to. We don't have that. We don't have those results, but it certainly would be nice to do some articulatory measurements. I totally agree. Yeah. Right. Okay, so let's move now to the next thing, which is personalized speech synthesis. So as I remarked, is that not everyone wants to sound like perfect Paul. People want to have their individual voice. Another thing that people apparently really like to have is the ability to express emotions. They really want to sound angry when they are angry and not always the same flaccid voice. So the obvious answer is, hey, why don't you get text-to-speech diphone recordings? And of course, that is the last thing that you can do with people who have dysarthria, because making diphone recordings of any speaker is an enormous challenge for that speaker. So it turns out, for example, that when recordings are made of me, that my voice is far too variable in terms of intonation, in terms of duration, in terms of pronunciation, to be usable for diphones. Okay, and so at CSIU we have built quite a bit of voices, and there's lots of individuals that have to be rejected, even professionals. So the idea that you would use this technology for dysarthric speakers is perverse. It's out of the question. It has been done though, and it failed. So the challenge then is, can you do something like uniphone synthesis? Because, yes, can you get a synthesizer by just getting, one or two good samples from a speaker for each of the, 40, 50, 60 or so phonemes or allophones? Is that possible? And so we started working on that, and here's what we did. So what we're basically doing, in a nutshell, is we are creating diphones by asynchronous interpolation between uniphones. By asynchronous interpolation, what I mean is that each phone is represented, say as a power spectrum, whatever, complex power spectrum, and then these power spectra are mapped onto two separate trajectories. One of them mostly reflecting formants, and the other mostly reflecting overall spectral balance. And then we independently manipulate those two representations to produce a diphone. And after that, then we do regular diphone synthesis. Okay, so here are the steps that we did. So first you have to determine a set of basis sounds, and how you do that, we don't quite know yet. So what we have been doing is, simply just assuming the standard set of phonemes that are used in diphone synthesizers. So you make certain, distinctions like between, aspirated T and unaspirated T and flapped T and things like that. Okay, but of course, there's a whole sub-project in here, namely how can you determine for a particular speaker what the basis sounds should be. The second step is that we record them from the target speaker, that is the speaker that we want the system to sound like. Okay, and we extract the spectral basis vector from each basis sound. And then here's the composition that I just mentioned, is that we extract formants and we extract spectral balance, and how we did that I'll mention in a sec. And then the second thing is that we take a standard speaker, for example, our control speaker, who is able to produce very good diphones. And then what we do for that person is that we take each diphone, and for each of those two component spaces, we're going to estimate the best weight functions. Okay, so now each diphone then is represented as a pair of weight functions that may or generally do not coincide at all. Okay, and we estimate that with a simple, least squares process that I'll mention in a sec. And in the synthesis, what we do is that we grab the basis vectors of the target speaker, that is the person that we want the system to sound like, but we grab the interpolation rates from the standard speakers. Okay, then we combine those two to produce these diphones, and then we do regular synthesis. So there's a heavy assumption in here that hasn't been tested yet, and that is that somehow everything that is individual about a target speaker's voice is contained in these basis vectors and not in the weights. Okay, and we don't know at all whether that is justified. So let's get a little bit then in the process here. So all that we have done so far is, I'd say a partial test of the concept where the target speaker was the same as the source speaker, and we just listened whether or not the individuality was preserved. But of course, we haven't been able to test using this process whether the individuality is sitting in the weight functions also in addition to the basis vectors. So that will be the next step. So let's talk a little bit about how we did this. So the first thing is deformants. And so in the cases of vowels and semivowels, liquids and glides, you can just get pretty good estimates with standard form tracking. And for other sounds, you basically have to estimate them from co-articulation effects. That you have to observe at what direction is the formant going out of and into a consonant. And you can also look it up in textbooks. There's plenty of ideas there. And then the other representation, which is less conventional, is that we use the formant normalized power spectrum. Okay, so we're not doing something as crude as just taking some measure of the overall spectral tilt. Okay, we want to be able to mimic the power spectrum in a fairly detailed level. So what we did then is that we did we frequency warp the power spectrum after we've determined the formants with simply setting the targets at 500, 1500, 2500 hertz. Okay, so now the effect of the reason that you have to do this is totally obvious, because suppose that you did a linear interpolation between two power spectra without first formant normalizing them. Then you're going to get formant spectra in between that have double peaks. Okay, so you just can't do that. So that's why we did it here. Very straightforward. So this shows the procedure a little bit, where you have on the top is a raw power spectrum, and the display on the bottom shows what it looks like after you do this formant normalization. From some point on, from 6,000 hertz on, we just left things alone. Okay, so then to get these weights per diphone, we use basically a three-dimensional dynamic time warping algorithm. And yes, here's kind of one way to look at it, and here's another way to look at it. So the original diphone is on the left, and the reconstructed diphone is on the right. And we put in there the two weight functions, one for spectral balance and the other for form of movement. And as you see, they do not coincide with, I believe, the spectral balance vector weight rising much faster and earlier than the formant. I forgot, unfortunately, which particular diphone this is. So this is then what it sounds like. So here's the original.
Cement is measured in cubic yards.
Okay, now we have a standard diphone synthesizer. Unfortunately, it's not a good one. There's something bad with the R at the end, but listen to it.
Cement is measured in cubic yards.
Okay, the yards is bad. And then here's...
Cement is measured in cubic yards.
Okay, so again, let's compare those two.
Cement is measured in cubic yards. Cement is measured in cubic yards. Okay,
so there's not a whole lot of difference, okay? So here's where we are then now. So, so this clearly preserved speaker identity, and in fact, the quality was pretty decent. But as I already said several times, we don't know whether that is because of the basis vectors or the time-varying weights containing the individual characteristics, and the quality still needs work. And next steps, of course, are going to be, just those things. Another thing you want to point out, though, here is that as a side effect, what we have done here inadvertently is actually reduce the diphone inventory by an enormous amount. Okay, so we have a very small footprint suddenly, and so one measure is in our standard method at CSU for synthesis, we use something called OGI residuals LPC, and so it uses line spectral frequencies and residuals. Okay, so it's actually larger than if you had stored raw speech, because you're also storing the line spectral frequencies, and the residuals have the same amount of bits. as the regular speech. So it's a little bit, overstating it here. And the only thing that you have to store in this new approach is these weight functions and the basis vectors. And the basis vectors are, I think, like 50 of them or something. And those weight functions, well, here they are stored in raw form. That is at 10 millisecond intervals for an average diphone duration of about 150 milliseconds. But when you look at those weight functions, it's very clear that they can be parameterized in an extremely parsimonious way. They're basically sigmoid, and so all you have to characterize is the point of steepest descent and the slope. Okay, so it can be compressed quite a bit more, and then you can do all kinds of vector quantization tricks and what have you. So it can certainly be squeezed by another factor of 2. So that's kind of neat, actually. And so we have kind of an interesting sequence of events here. Just when you step back up a little bit and talk about research in general, is that so we started out with a request for personalized DTS. Okay, so that was the application that we wanted to aim at. So I started thinking about that, and we came up with this idea of asynchronous interpolation, and then that then turns out to have actually not only be of scientific interest itself, but also be a very broadly usable application. Okay, so we thought that's kind of interesting. Okay, let's see how I'm doing time-wise. Okay, that's a good amount of time. So the next thing I want to go through fairly quickly is some diagnostic work on suspected apraxia of speech. Okay, so what it is, it's a apraxia that's general name for being unable to do something. Okay, you can have all kinds of apraxias, including apraxia of speech, and apparently this is a controversial disorder. That is, there's no consensus about what it really is, what's causing it, how to diagnose it, and so forth and so on. Okay, so that's why it is called suspected apraxia of speech. Okay, so
I don't understand it. If the person can't talk, there's no
no, they can talk.
problem, right?
They can talk. They can talk, but there's clearly something the matter with it. Okay, so these are.
Okay, so what do you mean suspected? It's there.
It's I think probably one of those political things in the clinical world that you can't really put a name on something unless
You don't know the cause, but
you don't know anything about it. You don't know whether it is a coherent set of syndromes. I mean, it's like ADHD 10 years ago. Are these kids just unruly and a pain in the neck, or is there really something there? So
we
it's
still don't know, do we?
I think there's some good evidence with some fMRI stuff that seems to be pretty solid, but you don't know.
Controversy because perhaps the health insurance doesn't want to pay for
Because
it.
perhaps
Because the health insurance may not want to pay for something.
It's quite possible.
If you agree that it's a abnormality which is of a physiological nature, then maybe you can make a claim saying I'm going to be treated.
Yeah. Well, it's really.
the suspicion is that the guy is simply nasty.
It's.
It won't talk.
No, these are kids, and I think the word suspected. It's so this is really work that we did together with Larry Schreiberg from University of Wisconsin, and Larry is a very conservative scientist who will stay a very long distance away from making claims that he doesn't think are 110% supported, and so it really reflects Larry's caution. I think that's what it is. So anyway. Larry has developed a couple of measures that we wish to automate. One of them he calls a coefficient of variation. So what's kind of the matter with these kids, so it seems, one could suspect, is that their timing is off. They don't make a distinction between stressed and unstressed syllables, and they also just chop up the speech stream into little phraselets that are far too equal in length. So they just stop talking every 800 milliseconds or something like that. And meanwhile they talk like a machine gun, okay, something like that. Okay, and so Larry developed a couple of measures. One is that is of course a measure of appropriate phrasing. It measures the excess in regularity. And then the other one is the lexical stress ratio, which is the lack of contrast between stressed and unstressed syllables. Okay, so what often happens in communication disorders is that you can have either too much of something or too little of something. And so the lexical stress ratio, they can also have excessive stress on a syllable. But in either case, it's far away from the norm. And the same thing with blood pressure. You can have blood pressure that's too high or too low. Okay? So what we did here is to measure lexical stress, the manifestations of lexical stress, not just for looking at duration, but also at amplitude, or in fact the average amplitude multiplied by the duration, and then also the frequency area, which is the average pitch multiplied by the duration. And then the way those measures are combined is just using principal components analysis over a whole bunch of words and kids. Okay. And so the challenge for speech technology was to simply automate this. Okay, so not any, whatever, deep discovery or whatever. And so the way we do that is by segmentation. And the results were basically this, were for 2 subjects. And yes, of course, we need way more subjects here. But this was just a pilot study for NIH funding. And this work was by Paul Hossam and not by myself. And so he got a very nice correspondence between the automatically determined lexical stress ratio and the reported, that is, clinically determined. And it was, kind of, within the standard error measurement. And I'm just going to kind of rush through this. The coefficient of variation ratio, we got, very similar results, again, in the sense that there was a good match between the clinically obtained and the and the automatically obtained measures. Okay, so now so it's all nice and well. So the really interesting thing, of course, here, and that's the real agenda, is after having shown that we can do a good job on automating this process, and that is, of course, was the main sales argument for getting the NIH funding, that the real agenda is trying to find new markers here. I mean, are there some aspects of speech that the naked eye cannot see, but you can only see when you use speech technology? For example, can you look at, instead of looking at averages, can you look at distributions of some of these temporal parameters? And is that more informative? Is there something awry with the correlations between the different acoustic features, like timing and F0? So there are lots of things that we can explore here, and we have about 3 years for doing that. Okay, and so that's the real attractor here. Let's see. The next thing is a little bit talk about autism. So autism is, I'm sure all of you have heard of it. So it is particularly poorly defined. One of the things that has happened over the past 10 years is that the definition has broadened a lot, so that kids who, say, 10 years ago will be diagnosed as having some kind of a language disorder are now suddenly included in the autistic spectrum. And in fact, also the whole terminology has changed from flat-out autism to autistic spectrum disorder. Okay, and so there's probably quite a bit of overdiagnosis going on. And another effect of this broadening of the definition is that now you have made the group of kids diagnosed with autism, that group now has become heterogeneous. Okay, so in a way you haven't solved any problems. One facet of the overdiagnosis is that there are all kinds of forms of state and federal aid for kids who have autism, and so there have been some dramatic cases where I believe in the state of Minnesota at some point the state decided to provide specific support for kids with autism, and the incidence rate just jumped up as a step function. Okay, but there have been a fair number of analyses that seem to show that over and beyond this overdiagnosis, there really also probably is a genuine increase in the incidence of autism, and what's causing that, whether it's environmental factors, nobody really knows. I mean, this is an area where parent groups are singularly assertive and at times really get enamored with certain hypotheses, such as the hypothesis that this is caused by mercury in inoculations for various diseases, and that mercury is responsible for this, but that's all still under study. Anyway, what we are focusing on really is prosody. Now, why do we want to look at prosody?
By the way, is this universal over all nations, or is this a
I think in Western Europe you find it too. Yeah.
This jump.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we want to work on clinical research tools for studying the role of prosody. Okay. So I assume everybody knows what prosody is. Anyone who doesn't know what prosody is? Okay. So now, why do we want to do that? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that so these individuals, they have a communication problem. Okay, they just don't connect with other people, and it certainly seems to be the case that if they had, enormous prosodic inabilities, that is, if they couldn't really express anything else in their speech than just the words itself, that certainly would be a hindrance for communication. Okay, so there's one connection. Then the second thing is that there are certain types of autism. One is called Asperger's syndrome. So Asperger's are people who are actually very high functioning. Okay, the majority of people with autism actually are, in almost like in a retarded range. Okay, so the idea of autistic people are a genius, well, that would be very nice, but it's just not the case at all. Okay, but there are definitely, high functioning autistic individuals, and an example of those are people with Asperger's syndrome. Now, people with Asperger's syndrome, they have a very peculiar way of talking, that their prosody is really off. Like one recording of an individual who basically talks for an hour at a frequency range of, say, between 175 and 185 hertz, okay, which is very high for a male, and is remarkably constant. And it's also of interest is that this is a clinical interview where all kinds of questions get asked, including questions about what's the weather like, but also questions about what's your sex life like. And completely independently of the contents of what the person is talking about, he will always maintain the same prosody. Okay, so there's a whopping disconnect there, or a whopping inability to express anything using prosody. Okay, so, but we don't know, with prosody deficits that are clearly there in autism, whether it is a chicken and the egg kind of thing. Like, is it the case that they were from birth on, lacking a theory of mind, that is, lacking the insight that other people are actually people too, and as a result of that, never bothered developing any kind of, social skills, including prosody, or is it that they had a, prosodic deficit to begin with, and that one of the results of that was the inability to connect to others? But all those issues are completely up for grabs, and there are huge, fights in the autism community about, which is what. So, the challenge that that we are looking at, from a technology research point of view, is how really can you measure expressive and receptive prosody? Okay, and so what we kind of thought of was, hey, maybe we can use some of the technologies that we developed for speech synthesis for that purpose. So that's what we're doing. We're looking both at expressive prosody and also at receptive prosody. Okay, so. First, just some very general terms about prosody. So there are the concept of prosodic parameters, which is all these things like timing, pitch, loudness. But there are also a lot more things to prosody that are generally ignored, certainly in synthesis, such as spectral balance, voice quality, and what have you. Okay, and then the idea, the concept in speech synthesis, where you actually have to predict these prosodic parameters from text, is that you have this intermediate level of representation, which we call factors or control factors. And so you have, for example, linguistic factors, and you can split those up into segmental factors, positional factors, and stress-related factors. So in a segmental factor, it is well known, for example, in American English, that when a vowel at the end of a sentence is followed by a voiced consonant, it will be longer than when it is followed by a voiceless consonant. Okay, and of course, it's also known that certain sounds are just intrinsically longer than others. Okay, like an S is longer than a Z, for example. Generally, voiceless consonants are longer than their corresponding voiced sounds. There are all kinds of positional effects. For example, it matters whether a consonant is in the onset or a coda of a syllable, generally longer when it is in the onset. It matters whether something is located at the end of a word, or as an Italian in the penultimate position in a word, or at the beginning of a word. And then there are effects of position in the foot. So a foot is defined as a stressed syllable followed by any number of unstressed syllables. There's a phrase, and so forth, and so on. So all these different units have boundary effects in the sense that the last sounds before the boundary tend to be longer than sounds that are farther away from the boundary. And a final class of quote-unquote linguistic factors are, say, stress-related factors like lexical stress, dictionary stress, phrase accent, which word is emphasized in the phrase, and so forth and so on. So these are all, easily handled, within speech synthesis. Then you have things that are really much more difficult, which is pragmatic factors, where you, in a way, using these earlier factors while modulating them, get something across. For example, you put contrastive stress on something. You put a phrase boundary somewhere to evoke a particular, to get a particular effect on the speaker. And finally, there are these affective factors, mental state, whatever. Okay, so those are all the things that we have to deal with when we want to analyze prosody in human as opposed to synthetic speech. So the question then, with expressive prosody and autism is, which of these factors are consistently expressed and how strongly are they expressed? And the real challenge is that, how can you measure that, given the inevitable factor confounding? Okay, suppose, for example, that you find that at some phrase boundary, a syllable looks, quote unquote, too short. Well, how can you say that? Because you have to know what is the syllable, is the syllable lexically stressed or not, or what have you. And in natural language, as opposed to nice little clean balanced experiments where you make sure that all combinations of all factor values occur equally often. In natural language, you never have that. Okay, in natural language, you always have confounding between all the factors, and you can't just by taking some dumb overall average decide what the effect of one factor is, because there are all these other factors doing things too. What we did then is that we used a TDS duration model that I've developed during my days at Bell Labs. And the process is the following thing, is that you get the transcript of the dialogue or monologue or whatever it is. And so, if you're lucky, you can do it with a speech recognizer, but that's probably doesn't work. But we don't care, because we're not really talking here about building an assisted device. Okay, we're building a research tool here, and so we don't care whether there's manual labor involved. So then you fit the duration model, and then you can estimate the parameters, and they then could be measures of the effects of these prosodic factors. So that gives you a sense of which of these factors are consistently expressed and how strongly they are expressed. So what we do then is use a very simple model that basically says that the duration of a segment S with lexical stress L, accent A, position P, and so on, is simply the product of a couple of factors. Okay, and this works pretty well, assuming that you estimate different parameters for different classes of segments. Okay, so for example, you really don't want to lump together, say, vowels and consonants together, because they may be affected very differently by the same factors. For example, lexical stress tends to, of course, increase the durations of vowels, but tends to keep the same or even decrease the durations of post-vocalic consonants. Okay, so you got to do this separately for different classes of phonemes. Now, because it's such a simple model, it's just no surprise that you can that this is a linear estimation problem, so you can get very robust estimates of these parameters, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. Okay, so now there's a deeper reason for using this multiplicative model, and which is that durations, at least within a certain phoneme class, have the very nice property of what we call durational invariance. And this is what I mean by that, is that when you look at two different vowels in identical contexts, okay, and you observe that one vowel, say the E, is longer than the E, okay, and now you look at the same two vowels again in a totally different context, but again a perfectly matched context, then what you generally will find is that again the E is longer than the E, okay. another factor like lexical stress. You may compare, say, the same vowel, stressed and unstressed, in both cases, phrase final, and so forth and so on. And now you look at a different vowel in another context, but again, totally matched except for stressed. Again, you will find that stressed is longer than unstressed. Okay, so what you basically find is that no matter what, the duration, the effects on duration of a given factor, they always go in the same direction. Okay, the amount by which they may affect duration may vary quite a bit. For example, the effect of on vowel duration of postvocalic voicing is, say, 70% lengthening in phrase final condition and only 5 or 10% in phrase medial condition. Okay, but it's still a positive change in both cases. All right, and all that this multiplicative duration model does is that it captures in the simplest possible way that particular fact about duration. Okay, now there are all kinds of other prosodic parameters like intonation, where this may not be the case at all. Okay, this may be highly specific to duration, but given that it is to a first order approximation really pretty true, it is nice to have a model that is simple and that really capitalizes on that little piece of knowledge. So then what you can do with this is the following thing, is to model in an even more simplistic way differences between speakers. Okay, this is work that I did together with Wentao Gu and Qilin Shi while we all were at Bell Labs. And so there we use this model to model differences between dialects of Mandarin. So what they're doing now is that they say that, okay, we're going to get these alpha, beta, and gamma parameter estimates from whatever, some standard speaker, and we're going to model individual differences simply by having power parameters here. Okay, so for example, when whatever speaker number 3, so I equals 3, has a very large effect of of accent, then maybe C sub I is 3 or something like that. And when someone else has no effect at all of pronounces all his vowels with exactly the same duration, and A sub I equals 0. Okay. And what you can do, of course, is that you can estimate these parameters from data. And actually you need very, very few data, because for a given speaker, you only have as many parameters as there are factors. And so, 6 factors is really all you need. And for 6 parameters, you don't need a whole lot. In fact, if you let this person say one sentence that has, say, at least 6 vowels in them, with a little bit of luck, that may be all you need. Okay, so and what it also means, of course, the fact that you need so few parameters to be estimated, that you can get robust estimates, because what you might be able to do is tricks like splitting up the data and estimating parameters for each of the subsets and then combining them with medians or what have you. All kinds of things you can do. It's always good to have few parameters. So here I have then recordings of this person with Asperger's syndrome, who talks in this very monotone way, and so forth and so on. And I have some durations here in the left panel. And so one of the things that you see is that certain words, like the word hours, okay, which in normative speech, so these are actually durations as predicted by a synthesizer, okay. And by the way, those parameters, they provided a really good fit of, I think, like 0.86 correlation between observed and predicted correlation with the normative speaker. So you see here's a very good case of where a person makes just no distinction whatsoever between hours de-accented and accented. Okay, and so if you go through the exercise of estimating these parameters here, you get indeed very low values for several of these factors for this particular speaker. Okay, so the summary then is that you can indeed estimate these parameters with very small speech samples, and during the next few years we will be doing this on a pretty large scale. We are ramping up for a study with about 300 kids between 4 and 7 years old. And what we think is that the major challenge that we really have to deal with is the multiplicity of prosodic taggings that are consistent with the word transcription. That is, what has to happen in the process here is that we get a transcript from the dialogue, but the transcript, of course, is not allowed to have any prosodic markers in there, and then a person who hasn't heard the speech has to tag them. And of course, there are many different ways you can do it. So that's gonna throw some sand in the soup. I don't know what that's say. I think it's, yeah. Usually, like other expressions like having butter on your head, that doesn't work either.
We have it in Czech.
Yeah?
Germans have it.
Butter on your head?
Yes.
It is. It's very bad. Right. So then, just a final example, which from a technology point of view is really fairly trivial, which is we were interested in processing of prosody in emotional stories. Okay, so we wrote some very emotional stories, and then we recorded them in two ways. So one way was with great passion, and the other was where we scrambled the sentence and then had someone, the same person, actually say them under the instructions to talk like a mediocre speech synthesizer, which he certainly did. And then we glued them back together, and then we equated over loudness level, pitch level, put in pauses so that they were actually completely identical, the two recordings, in terms of speaking rate, loudness, and average pause duration. Okay, so that's a fairly clean comparison. And we got some interesting initial results that we don't know yet what they mean. So we asked these kids two kinds of questions, namely social emotional questions like, why did the puppy get angry or something like that, and then factual questions like, what was the puppy's name, all right? And so what we got was, not surprisingly, that of course you got better performance on the social emotional questions of both kids with autism, autistic spectrum disorder, and the controls intact was better than scrambled. But then the factual questions, something strange happened, that suddenly the autistic kids didn't like it when they had to answer factual questions when the story was presented with great passion. And look, these are just n equals 10, okay, so we don't know whether this will hold up. But at least it shows actually a very basic thing, which is that even when you match these two different recordings very, very carefully, you have a real impact here of prosody on comprehension, okay, and that actually hasn't been established all that often in the past. Okay, so I think this is kind of it. So now, this general concept of applying speech technology for communication disorders, there are a lot more things you can do. For example, you can think about a whole new bunch of hearing aids that you may not want to use in face-to-face contact, but say over the telephone, or that you might want to use when you want to listen to the radio or radio recording. For example, systems that slow down fast passages. It seems like very trivial, but when you start thinking about it, it's actually not all that easy, because you can't really do it uniformly. If you do it uniformly, you may change a B into a V, for example, or you may make diphthongs like the I sound very weird if you do it uniformly. So you need some kind of detection. The other things you can also do here, such as hearing aids that enhance intonation, hearing aids that decorticulate speech, what have you. One thing actually we are working on is a voice-controlled switch for individuals with residual speech. There are people who are have had, say, a horrendous car accident, are completely paralyzed. They can't move their eyes, they can't move their head, they can't move anything at all, but they can still make some kind of sounds. There aren't even speech sounds. Okay, and so people are working on maybe developing some kind of a voice-controlled switch, and that's quite a challenge. In the diagnostic realm, we are working on objective measurement of stuttering events. And you say, hey, what do you need that for? Because someone stutters or they don't. Well, actually, that is not quite the case, because for example, there's an enormous amount of unreliability. That is, if you take your kid, 3 years old or something, who you think stutters, to 5 different therapists, then unless these therapists have been trained in the same school, you may get 5 different answers. And the reason for that is that the assessment is essentially subjective. They may tally some things, but it's essentially subjective. Another thing that's of interest here is, can you find some some markers, just like the suspected apraxia of speech? Can you find some markers that are predictive of what will happen with these kids? Because as it turns out, I've been told that when you look at these kids who are diagnosed as stuttering at age of 3, some 80% of them don't stutter anymore a few years later. And of course, parents are extremely anxious to find that out right then and there. And so are there some subtle markers in the speech that's prognostic of that? Maybe not. Maybe what you have to do is some big fMRI or neuropsychological assessment to predict that. We don't know that.
Or wait 3 years.
Parents are impatient. American parents are impatient. They don't take no for an answer. They want treatment now. Another one is kind of similar. We just submitted a grant on that, on early detection of dysarthria and prognosis. Like a person, elderly person notices that their speech seems to be slipping a little bit, and they want to know, my God, am I going to be like Steve Hawking, 3 years from now? Something that is, extremely challenging is. Suppose that you have a therapeutic dialogue between a therapist and a person, say, suspected of being autistic. There must be something that you can detect in what they are saying, not just in how they are saying it. Okay, that's the positive thing, but in what they are saying. So is there something in the contents that allows you to draw conclusions? And so that's something that I would like to work on. We're working on some audiology stuff, just automating a test. There is, language remediation with automatically generated pictures is something that Sport and I are working on. So WordSci is this incredible system that Richard and Bob Coyne and others have developed that has text as input and a picture as output. Okay, and so we are working with a speech person to apply this for language remediation in kids. So, this is a very incomplete list. There's just really, once you kind of take this perspective of, hey, let's look a little bit in the direction of communication disorders and what we can do, or what we might be able to do, there's really an unending list. So the summary is that, yes, there is a large number of applications, and the technology research, as the examples demonstrated, they range from things that are really quite mundane, such as this intact versus scrambled stories, signal processing manipulation, to things that are really quite challenging, such as duration analysis, uniform TDS, and the intelligibility enhancement for dysarthria. So now for the communication disorders community, there are quite a number of benefits. First of all, if we succeed in producing some of these applications, that's just neat for the people out there, both for research and for the end users. And it also creates kind of a newish area of techno-clinical research, and the trend at NIH seems to be to want more of that. That is, to get clinical researchers out of the often extremely narrow pipeline they are in, and start collaborating with other people, in particular technology people. Now, for the technology community, I've kind of have this theory of, I have worked at Bell Labs really for a very long time, starting in '79. And in '79, Bell Labs was the ultimate ivory tower. I remember on one occasion, my department invited someone from the applications area, and after about 10 minutes, people started yawning and giggling and walked away. Okay, so it was complete disdain for applications. It was the perfect ivory tower. Yet when I think about the kind of research that we were doing and that we were not doing, that even though we believed that we lived in this ivory tower, and it was purely coincidental that we happened to be at AT&T, which is a telecommunications company, clearly that fact that we worked at a communication company had an influence on the kind of questions that we asked, and more importantly, on the kind of questions that we did not ask. Okay, for example, we would absolutely not bother with communication disorders unless it was mandated by law. Okay, so there's this kind of application space that people always have in mind. And what I'm kind of suggesting is that when you put communication disorders in that application space, that you will broaden the range of the kind of problems that we study, and I think that's a nice thing. For example, when you look at ASR, how can we incorporate deep articulatory modeling in ASR? And yes, I know it is happening, but more of it should happen. And so I think that this could stimulate basic knowledge research, and it may benefit also applications outside of communication disorders, such as this tiny footprint TTS system that we are working on. And as a side thought, yes, I believe there is NIH funding available for that kind of research. Thank you.
So this business of wanting to sound like you would sound if you weren't.
Yeah.
Is the idea that these are people who are damaged later?
Well,
In other words, that people remember. I mean, after all, people have these ridiculous things, right? And they have their own sound, and somebody plays some hymn, and others rings the bell, etc. So it could be characteristic of you, regardless whether it sounds like you used to sound.
Well, let's give a couple of dramatic examples. Like one example, of course, is that suppose you have throat cancer, okay, and you know that you're going to have surgery and you're going to whack out your vocal box, your voice box. So that's a very clear example where you want to come in, before the surgery and make some recordings. Other thing is that people have videotapes of themselves these days. And there's certainly enough speech material in there. But you're questioning really why people want it.
No. I didn't realize that actually most of the cases are not congenital.
Oh no, dysarthria, that's right. Dysarthria is typically the elderly. I mean, almost exclusively the elderly. And so,
there is a record of how they used to sound.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and also at times, like when we go through a long recording session with this one dysarthric patient, that she will sound pretty good in the beginning of the session, but then after 5 or 10 minutes, she'll go downhill, and so that means that on incidentally they are able to to produce some decent speech, but again there are huge individual differences all over the place.
I guess the question is, do they really want their own voice, or do they want more detailed control? For example, maybe they want the intonation to be the way they're trying to make it come out, or the stress to be where they want it to be.
That's quite possible. Is it just what I hear from from our clinical partner?
The deck talk synthesis.
Yeah.
My problem with it is that it doesn't convey anything beyond the words.
Right. We know that that's certainly something they want too, but they make a distinction. They want both, I believe. But I have this all from hearsay. I mean, I haven't done any opinion survey or something.
So how far are we from being able to do things like that? I mean, centuries, decades?
Well, I think that the most difficult thing is, okay, I think that being able to mimic someone's, quote unquote, pre-morbid voice quality, I think that's feasible. Where things I think are going to totally fall apart is if you want to mimic their prosodic patterns, because they're very individual, and if you don't have a lot of recordings of that, and the other problem, of course, is that suppose you really want to build a voice a box that people talk through, and it comes out on the other side is really the way they sounded 10 years ago. In order to make the prosody work. Unless there still is some residual prosody, that is, there may be some very subtle hints, like like a 0.3 increase in dB, for example. Maybe you can learn to map that onto some beautiful pitch contour, what have you. I doubt it very much. And so, if that's not possible, then what you're really stuck with is a monumental challenge to ASR basically, and to prosody recognition, and to prosodic modeling. And so, yeah, 100 years sounds a good estimate.
Well, it's really a race between the medical profession and us, right? I mean, it would be much better if the medical profession could repair them.
Right.
And then we don't have to do any of these
Right.
speech recognition.
Right, but unfortunately, I agree. It's it's certainly not much fun, is it? Now, the thing, of course, is that now we talk about neurons deeply in the brain, and so that would, well, maybe nanosurgery will solve all problems.
Maybe what Ronald Reagan talked about yesterday might solve it.
Junior, right? Yeah. care. Thank you.